this part of Poland in the first part of the war. That's what happens in 1939. And then 1940, you see that the area, the gray area has expanded. Hitler's gone up into Norway. He's taken Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, and France. Italy, of course, Italy controls Italy, but it also controls this part of North Africa. Then in 1941, Hitler's going to attack Russia. And you see he gets a big chunk of Russia. Okay? So this is the situation out at the end of Phase 1, December 1941. Hitler controls all of this. There's fighting going on down here. But basically Hitler controls all of Europe except for Great Britain and Russia. Okay? Now, just to give you a little bit of an idea about how costly World War I was. Again, you see the map of Europe. Who lost the most in World War II?
Poland.
Poland?
Germany. France.
Poland lost a lot, right?
France.
Poland lost...
No, it's
the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is the one that lost the most, 23 million people.
Oh, wow.
Okay? About 10 million of those were soldiers, about 12 million were not soldiers, civilians. Well, a lot of those civilians, a million of them were Jews, which got taken to the concentration camps. The other civilians were caught in the middle of big battles. There were also some massacres of civilians who were considered to be communists. And many of them died because of starvation and stuff, because they lost their homes. They froze to death when the winter sets in. They didn't have homes anymore because the homes got bombed. The food supplies were cut off because of the fighting going on. So many of them were kind of caught in the middle and killed. Okay, Poland did lose a lot. They lost 5.5 million. 240,000 of those were soldiers. 5,300,000 were not soldiers. So you're seeing that World War II is a war that not only included people who were there to fight, right? But there was including a lot of other people.
It killed civilians.
More civilians actually died than soldiers in World War II. And of course, of those 5 million civilians, 3 million of those were Jews who were sent to the camps. That's where most of the Hitler's
civilians died because of blitzkrieg.
Yes. The bombing of cities, and the kind of the total war aspect of it. All right, how about Germany? They're going to end up losing 7,300,000.
What? How?
Because Germany was, most of those were soldiers. 5.5 million of them were soldiers. Okay, so because the army is fighting in a lot of different places in a lot of big battles. But they also lost almost 2 million in civilians mainly because of the bombing of the cities, right?
So someone bombed Germany.
Pardon?
Someone bombed Germany.
Somebody bombed Germany? Yes.
Right.
By the end of the war, Germany is being bombed 24 hours a day. Okay? And most of the major cities, and not even the major cities, but most of the even good-sized cities are bombed completely. Germany is a heap of rubble by the end of the war. Okay? And of course, the civilians are going to get caught in that. Okay, other countries that lost a lot were France. You see that the numbers are lower in France than some of the other countries, right? Why? About 587,000.
Because it's a small country.
No, France is not a small country.
Because it was conquered by Germany.
Because France surrendered before.
France surrendered in 1940, right? So France was only fighting for, less than a year of the war. Okay, and once they surrendered, then they didn't lose that many more. How about Britain?
not so many either.
Not so many either, right?
Because
Total deaths,
This is-
400, about 450,000.
Is Heubner,
Why are the numbers low there?
numbers what?
Why are the numbers
'Cause,
rather low compared to like Germany?
Because they
and
retreated
Russia?
back.
Pardon?
Because they retreat back to the countries and
Well,
didn't fight
again,
until the
most of
end.
these deaths are, there weren't the huge set battles where you had millions of people on one side fighting and millions of people on the other side, like in Russia. And up until about 1944, Britain was fighting down here in North Africa, but only in the last part of the war from 1944 to 1945 were they in large numbers on the ground in Europe. That's when the D-Day invasion happens. So the bulk of the fighting for the first 4 years of the war is over here in the Soviet Union. Yes.
wasn't Britain heavily bombed?
Britain was heavily bombed, yes. And what happened to our numbers? But their civilian deaths were still relatively low compared to some of the other countries, 67,000. Why do you suppose that is? Yeah.
Because some of the airplanes were shot down by the British Army.
Okay, they were putting up a defense that was pretty good. What else?
There were other alliances with Britain, and there were volunteers coming from the United States and volunteers coming from France and these countries. They were able
Well,
to
they
defend.
were, but they were still getting bombed pretty heavily. Yeah.
The government told them to riot, not to go out on the streets.
They had a pretty good plan for protecting their civilians. Where did the civilians go during bomb
Underground.
attacks?
Underground.
They went into the subway system, yes. And many of them slept there night after night where they couldn't get hurt. Many people were still hurt that stayed up above ground, but if you went underground, you were going to survive. Your house might be knocked over and burned and so forth, but the casualties were kept low because they did have a good plan for survival. Okay? And many of the people in London, the children of London, were evacuated to the countryside where it wasn't being bombed. Okay, so they did a fairly good job of protecting their people during the war. How about Italy? Again, about the same number as Great Britain, 450,000. And most of those are military, 300,000 military, about 150 civilian. Okay? Countries that you don't really hear too much or think too much about in World War II actually suffered quite a bit. Czechoslovakia, which you don't really imagine too much in the war, but they lost 340,000 people. Okay? Yugoslavia, 1 million people. Okay? And we rarely even think about Yugoslavia when we think about World War II, right? But there was heavy fighting in Yugoslavia. Germany occupied it early on, but then there was kind of a guerrilla war taking place for 4 or 5 years in Yugoslavia, which included a lot of civilian deaths and also soldier deaths.
Was it neutral?
Pardon?
Wasn't Czechoslovakia neutral?
Or
They got invaded because as the armies moved across here, they had to go through neutral countries. So most of the countries that were neutral actually got tugged into the war. Okay. The ones that did stay neutral were Spain and Portugal. But the countries over here, because you had huge armies going back and forth in that area, so even if they wanted to stay neutral, they couldn't. And of course, here the same thing. The Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium, were all neutral, but they got invaded anyway. Okay. Romania, 800,000. Again, a country that we don't think too much about anymore. Bulgaria, not too much. small country, suffered a lot. Okay. These are some other countries that aren't on the map. Countries that you would expect to have suffered a lot did. Japan, 2,700,000. Okay. What's the real surprise here is this one, China. 20 million. Okay.
16 million
People
civilians.
die in China. Of course, when we think about World War II, we always, we tend to focus on the European side of the war, but we kind of forget that there was a major war going on actually for several years before the European war even started. Japan and China were hammering each other and continued to do so all the way through the war. But, because our textbooks tend to be Eurocentric and so forth, and we tend to forget about the Asian War before Pearl Harbor. There was a big, big war, and China was the one that lost the second most number of people. Some other ones that lost quite a bit.
Vietnam.
India, 1.5 million.
Why
Why did they lose so many? Yeah.
Because with the British, there was a British colony over there. The British took over India.
The British did have India as a colony, but a lot of Indians were actually fighting in the British Army. The Indians were recruited to fight for the British. Okay? And along the edges of India, Burma, there was a lot of heavy fighting in Burma between the Japanese and the British. So India suffered a lot. And Vietnam,
Million.
1 million. So those are the major ones. So the scope of World War II is you can't hardly imagine what it was like to be alive during that period of time, because the whole world really, really, really was at war. Okay? One way or another, almost everybody in the world was affected. And it was, one of the world's worst tragedies, in the history of humanity. Okay. Everybody kind of clear on phase 1 now? All right, we're going to watch a little bit of a video. It's not very long, 10 or 15 minutes long, but it shows a lot of the footage from what we've been talking about, and it's in color. It's kind of hard to find color video of World War II. Most of it's